Hi. How you doing? All righty then. Let's get started. How many of you in here have ever had hair that needed to be cut? Nice. I remember when I had that problem. Oh, the 90s. My boyhood days, man. I remember specifically being in barbershops when I was a kid, specifically because I had a lot of hair. I had the tall kid in play box. Y'all remember that one? You know what I'm talking about? That thing that looked like you just had like a wedding proposal jewelry kit like right on the top of your head. I had that, but I also had the slope, I had the Gumby, had it all. But one thing that was going on in these barbershops was that I was getting culture. These guys who were cutting my hair were also cutting my hair while involved in conversations. And these conversations were something that anthropologists are now calling environmental learning. I was picking up identity through the men around me who were simply doing their jobs. And a lot of them were from places from highly black populated areas, Louisiana, I remember, Detroit, some of them from California. So I never, while growing up in Denver, felt the lack of black folks going on at all. I felt like I was always surrounded by folks who looked like me. And I didn't realize that was purposely engineered by my parents. Some of y'all know my dad, a cat named Theo Wilson, who's in charge of a private guide incorporated. Back in those days, he was just Sid from Brooklyn. And what he wanted to do was make sure that his son got the black experience regardless of whether or not he grew up in the environment that my father did, right? And what was interesting was the time period. In that time in the 90s, the black community went through this very strange split. It was a dichotomy that was a result of integration. On one hand, you had a great advancement into corporate life. There was a huge explosion of the black middle class at that point in time. We had access to things that we never had access to. And that is a direct result of the civil rights movement and the actions that our forebears took. And then on the other hand, you had this other segment that happened at the same time. I just call it the crack era. The era of Snoop and Dre, the era of Tupac. The things that I grew up being influenced by when I was outside of my father's reach. I was on the schoolyard, right? I was in the neighborhood doing what I had to do, and I was learning these things environmentally. And one of the things that I did not realize is that I was looking at internalized racist trauma playing out among black folk. What happened when you keep telling a kid that he's bad? He eventually believes it. What happened when you keep telling African people that they are the N-word? They believed it. And I got called that a lot by black people. But it was in the term of brotherhood. I think we've all had this discussion at one point in our lives. Why do they get to say that to each other and I can't say that to them, right? Well, for me, that was just a part of life. And what we were looking at in that era was a reckoning of the internalized hate with new opportunities. And that there was this middle class that was getting all this light. I call that the Cosby era, right? There was a Cosby era and there was a crack era happening simultaneously, right? Now with that, black identity began to change. And we began to go through an identity crisis as a result of that. And so the things that I was afraid of most often were from folks that looked like me. I remember just growing up, my first incidents of like seeing crack cocaine was on the schoolyard. I remember my bullies wearing rags that denoted a certain set, a certain gang. There was a lack of trust in the community. There was a lack of the ability to say that this person is a friendly, this person is not a brother anymore, this person is not a sister anymore. And so around that time, I did join the NAACP. And to me, they were too focused on fighting the external enemies. I wasn't concerned about the Ku Klux Klan at that point. I was concerned about the Crips, the Rolling 30s, right? What were we going to do to address this internalized self-hatred? What were we going to do to rebuild the bonds? Well, after I graduated college, I came back home to Denver, and there was an organization that was called CORE, Colorado Organization for Racial Equality. They were backed by the Daniels Fund, and I got called into a meeting, and they said, why don't we do this? Why don't we organize what's already going on in barbershops and make community forums out of them? Hey, Theo, you talk good. How about you lead them? Okay, all right, it's fine, whatever. So we began to do that. And I remember it was like men only. It was like, the man tribe. We had to get together and talk about things that men talk about, But specifically, there was a wounding among black men. There's a lack of trust among us. And we didn't feel comfortable talking about those things in front of women, because we felt that we would be judged, and the female gaze affects men in a certain way. And so we just got these groups together and we began to build, starting right where we were. And the leader of the organization got shipped off to the military. And I was like, what am I going to do? I didn't have a good foundation of how to run an organization back in those days. So it fell apart. 2012, he calls me up and he says, hey, how about we start this up again? I was like, where are you, bro? He was like, I'm in Washington, D.C., and it's huge out here. We want you to be in charge of the Denver chapter. So we began Barbershop Talk again. And this time I said, we're not just going to talk, but we're going to do. We're going to start branching out into community action. What I didn't realize was that I was on the cusp of a new epoch in history at this point. 2012 was also the year that Trayvon Martin got shot. So we were already creating these safe spaces for the African American community to go before the Black Lives Matter wave hit. And because that was there, we were already like a net. So we ended up absorbing this momentum. And then I was asked to do stuff like write grants, which was scary because it had all of these things called details that I wasn't necessarily good at. But over time, I learned them, and I began to build an organization that was a legitimate community functioning grassroots organization. And what I noticed is that in this new era, in this new epoch, what I was faced with was a feeling of defeatism, that we've trod down this road before. And anything that looks like advancement for our community, we've already done that and failed. Now, this was a new challenge for me. I didn't understand exactly where to go with that, so I started saying, what did we miss along that whole way? What was swept under the rug? What things aren't being talked about? Let's bring those to the forefront. And one of the things that we never really understood was the effects of a specific kind of trauma. That's transgenerational trauma. And that what you learn environmentally, like I said, gets passed down from generation to generation. And a lady named Dr. Joy DeGruy has talked about that, has written a book about it. Who's heard of Dr. Joy DeGruy? That's all right. It's not a cool kids assessment. You ain't going to be quizzed on this. But Dr. Joy DeGruy talked about transgenerational trauma. And she said, how did you learn to bake a lemon meringue pie? You learned because your mama taught you. That's how you learned. How do you know that she got the ingredients right? See what I'm saying? And we learned that about the formulas and the recipes for life. Addressing this transgenerational trauma thing is the main focus of what Shop Talk Live does now. And it was kind of politically incorrect when we decided to focus solely on the African American community. But the fact is that minority doesn't encompass everything for everybody. People in the Latino community won't necessarily be as concerned about anti-Semitism as somebody in the Jewish community. You see what I'm saying? We have specific issues that we have to deal with. What on earth does this have to do with medicine? It's a great question. Well, there's something called iatrophobia. Iatrophobia. I thought that was a really cool word. I said it a lot of times in the mirror this morning to make sure I said it right today. Iatrophobia, the fear of medicine. You're treating these communities who have been traumatized by medicine. And the trauma around medicine in the black community has not really been delved into. There's a wonderful book that I want y'all to look into. It's called Medical Apartheid. Medical Apartheid, by a woman named Harriet Washington. And in Medical Apartheid, she addresses race-specific iatrophobia in the black community. the very things that I was trying to address. Where does this distrust come from? It comes from an experimentation history. We weren't just slaves, we were guinea pigs. This is some pretty dark stuff. I was told to kind of lift things up. I'm going to do it later, I promise. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we're actually here to talk about. Inequality was something that was seen as science in the 1800s. Black physical inferiority. Now we, like, the general stereotype these days is like, no, they're pretty good physically, right? But back in those days, that wasn't the case. And that was also thought to be a thing with the mind. The fact that I'd be up here talking to you in plain English was looked at as scientifically impossible 150 years ago. And because of that, it was likely that black bodies would be thrown into experiments. There is a statue in Central Park in New York City of a gentleman who is revered as the premier gynecologist that has ever lived in this country, who was the highest paid medical doctor of his time. He used black slave women that he bought to experiment without anesthesia. The speculum was evolved from 2 pewter spoons that he used to put into these slave women. We heard about the Tuskegee experiments. Now, that's not to be confused with the Tuskegee Airmen, who I'm a descendant of, by the way. My grandfather, Theo Wilson, was a red tail, right? But the Tuskegee experiments, what's not talked about is how long they lasted. They began in 1942 and ended in 1972. 1972. 8 years before I was born. I'm a millennial, barely. I'm like a Gen X and X-millennial. I think I'm a zennial. I think that's what they call it. But this is a thing that you're dealing with when you're talking about addressing underserved communities. It's not quite underserved when you look at historically. It's abuse. When you understand what Henrietta Lacks is, who knows about Henrietta Lacks? Yeah, she's getting a lot of light and attention. Cured polio off of herself. Amazing, right? And so we would like to sweep these things into the past, but they are not the past. They are still with us even today. Because when I held a Shop Talk Live about the vaccine debate, you know, which is not really a hot button issue right now, right? The vaccine debate. The iatrophobia of the community that I serve came right back. And there's evidence on both sides that's pretty compelling, but I'll tell you this. I don't want black children not to be immunized because of a cultural fear that we have that is based in real terror. So how do we get past that? You got to understand what you're dealing with when you have these folks in your offices. If you do not, you're going to trip over some landmines. And I don't want to stand on this stage here today and not put something in your brain to at least understand that there might be a little bit of extra mile that you have to go to. And it might serve you as well to understand how transgenerational trauma affected white people. You see, we talk about this diversity thing. We talk about examining white privilege. And I asked myself, you know, if I was white, why on earth would I give this up? Why? Some good stuff, man. You get to be president without qualifications. I like it, right? Trauma shows up through an emotional lens, y'all. It very seldomly has anything to do with logic, as my good folks pointed out over here earlier. And that emotional lens for white people, often, or people who would classify themselves as white, damn, I hate these definitions, don't y'all? Aren't you getting tired of this stuff? But listen, folks who we would classify as white people have a trauma as well. And that trauma is around feeling, I'm getting into the feeling world now, unfairly pointed out as a bad guy that you weren't trying to be. And that comes from people who unfairly felt that they were being victimized, and often they were. And then that bias thing kicks in, and you're the target, right? Breaking that down, examining what that does to you emotionally is going to be the thing that gives you the emotional latitude to deal with some very difficult folks who walk into your office. I'm sure you've seen them. I've been one of them. I had to examine my own iatrophobia when it came to my relationship as a black man to the medical field. But I believe, and I strongly believe, that the time has come for this to be addressed because the momentum is there. And I like what I'm seeing. Somebody asked me, how do you feel about this conference? I was like, well, they trying. I got to give them that. I got to give some folks some effort who extend themselves to make themselves at least open to the idea of new possibilities. This is the hardest stuff that you're going to have to deal with. And you're diving right in. And I appreciate y'all. Can y'all give yourselves a round of applause for that? But just saying, I'm going to try. I'm going to give it, I was going to say the old college try, but I just said try. But the point is that it's not easy. And I understand that this is something that if it doesn't get right, like people die, that's a hell of a responsibility. I have compassion for that. But one thing that I'm reminded of is that we've come kind of a long way already. The things that we take for granted in the modern world. The fact that I'm up here talking in Keystone, Colorado, black enough to be recognized as black down the street. That's what my family calls far away black. That's a different kind of thing, intraracial politics. We're gonna get y'all on that in a second. And to be seen as somebody who actually has something valuable to add means that somebody who doesn't look like me made some strides as well. And that's what I most appreciate about this convention here today. So with that, honestly, I'm going to sit my tail down, and we're going to have us a discussion that delves into the things that matter the most. So once again, I have time to pump myself shamelessly. Now, so the organization Shop Talk Live, we are right now registered as a community organization, and so we're open to folks who want to have these dialogues. They are held at the Montbello Barbers. Who's here's like Denver-based? Who do I got my Denver-based people? Yeah, all right. She was like, yeah, all right, I love you. She's so much. She's like Ms. Fowler. She's an amazing lady. But we're Denver-based. And we are also now opening up in Aurora. And so it's Montbello Barbers, 48th and Chambers, every first Wednesday of the month. And then we have Quality Care Hair in Aurora every second Monday of the month on Mississippi and Chambers. We do a lot of work on Chambers because I got a poetry venue I have to run tonight on 6th and Chambers. So, yay. But come on out if you want to have these community dialogues. We are shoptalklive.org. And we are Shop Talk Live, Inc., Colorado. And I got a book where I talk about my journey into activism and what that meant coming from the circumstances that I came from. So it's called The Law of Action, and it can be found on Amazon. All right? Thank y'all very much for your time today.